Okay, shall we start? Okay, so
Sure.
welcome everyone. I'm not going to make announcements about how many gold medals Arthur won last week. Um, yes.
Right.
So we'll just get right into it. So next year's Hayesenbrau, we decided after some voting that we're going to do rye beers. I don't think we've decided on what that exactly means. I think last time we said at least 10% rye in the mash, and that can be crystal or other rye. But Craig said he will do a talk about it, and that gives us more than enough time, 6 months, to brew a rye beer ready for Hazenbrow. So, with no further ado, over to you, Craig. Thank you.
Okay, how do I take control here? I think I need to be given some power.
Should be able to. There should be a green button at the bottom that says share.
Ah, I got it. Yep. Thank you. Uh, okay. How does that look?
Perfect.
Good. Okay. Let me just slide this thing over. Okay. Right. So as Jacques was mentioning, we're doing the Hazenbrow for brewing a rye beer, and it's a little bit different than doing something where we're uh, brewing a particular style. Now we're talking about something with a particular ingredient. And I've always been just kind of curious about brewing with rye, although I never had. I always liked a good rye IPA. I've never had a Ruggen beer, although I would love to have one at some point, and may at some point. So that's kind of the general introduction here. These images here kind of show two different examples of the grain in the field. And I don't know if you can tell by the picture, but the kernels on the barley are a little bit fatter and more plump than those of rye, where they are kind of longer and thinner in general. So this is kind of an example of what it looks like in the field, because every once in a while we get a post on the Slack that says, "Hey, I see this grain. What is it?" So now we can look back at this and wonder if it's plump enough to be barley or thin enough to be uh, rye. Okay, so rye is basically an extremely ancient cereal grain. It grows in relatively poor soil and cold conditions. It's often grown as a winter crop, and it's a common crop in Northern Europe and Asia, in the colder climates. It's one of the principal grains that have been cultivated by people for as long as people have been writing things down, probably longer than that. And like any other cereal grain, it can be malted and made to be self-converting. And this has some unique properties that make it useful for all different kinds of foodstuffs that people make, including bread, maybe wash for distilled things, wort for beer, rye whiskey, and of course beer. Um, Commercially, you don't see very many rye beers. Um, and perhaps one of the reasons is that it can be difficult to brew with. And so difficult, problematic in terms of energy, in terms of process, in terms of time, setup of your brewery. I'm not sure about cost, but it can be difficult to work with. And so that is probably at least one mitigating factor on why we don't see so many commercial rye beers. Okay, that being said, so there isn't a whole lot of information available in terms of books and things like that about brewing with rye. And indeed, um, a search of the internet finds a handful of articles, a couple of descriptive links, and a couple of key recipes that are kind of held up in different styles. And in looking this over, I kind of grouped things into two general categories. They're sort of traditional farmhouse beers that are what they say on the tin. They're made in small batches on farms. They could be raw ales, like Jacques was just talking about. The most kind of well-known one um, in the home brewing world is probably Sati because it's listed on the BJCP guidelines, and that's a Finnish type beer, and in which some rye can be used, but it is not required. I was unaware of a lot of these rye beers that are listed in the links below there, but they are kind of mentioned on this brewingnordic.com website, which is a site curated or written by Mika Latinen, who is a big fan of brewing with rye. He's written up some nice procedures there, and he describes a lot of traditional farmhouse beers and how they can be made, and their histories, mostly across Northern Europe here. So you can see that Tari, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, is a Karelian beer. This Kotuolo is from Estonia and Western Russia. And there are additional farmhouse beers in Russia and even kind of low alcohol beverages like kvass and other things. And so those are the kind of ancient beers that have been made with rye for a very long time. Um, the other kind of category one could group these things into are the modern craft styles that we see in the BJCP guidelines or that you might see commercially on occasion. And I would say those are kind of, based on what I was finding on the internet, can be divided into a couple of categories. Roggen beers, which originated in Bavaria, and there are still some brewed in Austria. There's a rye PA, which is a kind of modern twist on American IPA, advocated perhaps most famously by Denny Kahn and his Rye Smile recipe. There are some red rye ales that you see pop up periodically, or rye ambers. And then there are sort of specialty grains or alternative grain beers that you see with that can have rye stouts, rye porter, amber rye, you name it. You can put rye in it and call it a rye beer. So I think we could probably do a whole presentation by itself on the traditional farmhouse beers and how each tradition is important, but I'm not going to do that since that's not something I know too much about. And I'm going to kind of acknowledge that these things exist and then not talk about them anymore. But perhaps that's something we could pick up later or we can talk about at the end. So I'm going to kind of focus on working with rye and talking about the modern craft styles that we often see, but are really actually kind of challenging to find commercially. So what does rye bring to beer? Well, the earliest reference I could find to this, if you look in BJCP, they kind of cite Michael Jackson's book. I happen to have this book, so I pulled it out and opened up and found some of these quotes. And the current BJCP guidelines are largely quoted for Roggenbier, are largely quoted directly from Michael Jackson's book. So I would say, based on this, I would infer that there is perhaps a direct link between the modern BJCP Roggenbier style and this write-up of 2 pages in Michael Jackson's book. And he says here that with its fruity, spicy, oily, sometimes peppery, minty notes, rye has the most assertive flavors of all cereal grains. And that's in there in a section in this beer companion that also has a section on Sati there. And then from this Nordic brewing site, there's this quote, the taste of rye is stronger and grainier and more rustic than barley. And then the last thing in the BJCP here, it says, the use of rye doesn't mean that it should taste like caraway, a dominant, often spice used in rye bread. And that's probably aiming squarely at U.S. homebrewers who often just run with license on a particular topic and say, well, if we're going to use rye, I expect it to taste like rye bread, so I'm going to chuck some caraway in there. And you can actually find some interesting beer recipes on the web where somebody has toasted some caraway seeds to make a sort of a spicy rye saison or something along those lines. So it's not that you can't use caraway, but that's not really what rye means here. Okay, so what does rye add to the beer? In general, the characteristics you'll find describing rye are spicy, peppery, earthy aroma, improved head retention, some enhanced body, oily, silky mouthfeel, typically a higher finishing gravity, a sort of dry tartness in the finish, and also haziness or cloudiness. So these things kind of combine to say that to perhaps enhance hop bitterness and dryness and tart sensations on the palate. And also, rye can, of course, be made into as a grain that can be malted. It can also be made into specialty malts like crystal, chocolate, roast, biscuit, and whatever. And so you can then introduce rye characteristics in addition to these kind of roasted flavors. So one of the questions I kind of have here is like, how does this dry spiciness manifest itself in beer? Because I haven't had that many different rye beers. The one I made mostly, but then there's also, does it show up in the aroma? They talk about aroma as slightly spicy, a flavor as slightly spicy. But is this sort of a palate sensation that they talk about here is oily and silky, but also a dry tartness in the after palate. And you'll see some more of this in some of the further slides. So I'll keep going here. We can talk about the end. So is there aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, all of the above, none of the above? Okay. So when you're formulating a beer recipe, there's kind of two things to think about in terms of just rye. And the first one is how much rye do you want to put in? And then the second one is maybe what kind of rye do you want to put in and what are you trying to achieve? And there are lots of different recipes that approach this in different ways. And I was trying to think of, well, what's a general way to convey this so people kind of can make some informed choices on this. So typically rye beers or Roggen beers will have somewhere between 5 and 60% rye. The low end being as a subtle spice, and the high end being like a heavy duty Roggen beer. So if you have about up to 10% or so of rye, this will kind of come through as a subtle, delicate aroma, some flavor, some mouthfeel. And that's a kind of a background, almost imperceptible amount, depending upon where you are in that 0 to 10%. At about 15 to 20%, the rye can become a distinct character threshold. And these are just rough guidelines, not exact prescriptions by any stretch of the imagination here. And then when you get to 220, maybe up to 60%, you're going to have more of that character, more of that spice, more of the palate sensation, and increased viscosity of the final beer and that silky mouthfeel. And so whether or not you like rye depends, or what fraction you want of these characteristics in your beer will kind of dictate what fraction of rye to put in. And then here are a couple of quotes again from Denny Kahn and Mika Latinen here that says, this is something from Homebrew Talk by Denny Kahn, who is one of these advocates of rye PA, and he's brewed a lot of different kinds of rye beers. You can find rye brown ales and other things in his experimental brewing page. And it basically says, hey, if you like rye, you could keep it up at 40%. If you're just trying rye out, you'll want something closer to 20%. And I would go back up to these bullet points above and say, if you just want the rye character to stick out a little bit, 15 to 20% will get you there as a recognizable character. And if you really like that character, then double down on that would be another kind of paraphrasing of this. And then this Mika Latinen quote basically says, if rye, the best rye beers he has had are between 15 and 40% rye. Okay, so rye can be subtle and not quite recognizable, but a significant ingredient. And another example at the low end of this might be Oregon Trail, which has about 6.5% rye. Okay, so that's a beer that we all know, but we may not think of it as a rye beer necessarily. So there's an example of that. Okay, so what I kind of go through here now is describing some of the things that rye base malts might contribute, and talking about the different types of base malts, rye base malts that are out there. And in the Slack channel, I've put an Excel spreadsheet with basic descriptions and brewing parameters for the rye malts and rye adjuncts that are available locally and in the US. And I include the US ones because a lot of the recipes you'll see online call for just rye malt. And if they're from the US, they're probably using Briess or Great Western. And if you're substituting something else, then they will be different. And I would encourage you to kind of pop that spreadsheet open and just have a quick look. One of the things I've realized over the last few months, and a phrase I have come to appreciate is that's in the new book by Andy Parker is from the early days of home brewing. And I take that to mean from like the 1990s and 2000s, roughly speaking. And since I've had about a 10 or 15 year hiatus from homebrewing and just come back to it recently, I have to realize whenever I see that, they're talking about me as one of these brewers from the early days of homebrewing. Okay. Um, so in the early days of homebrewing, you would see these recipes that would say, put in 80% pale malt. But now we know that there's different country, all the different countries where you can get the malt from, German, Belgian, English, and then the different maltsters from within that, and each of those are slightly different depending upon how you use them. So when you see recipes for rye beers, though, they just say rye malt, and there's many different types of rye base malts and character malts. And so the, so what this spreadsheet that I've attached or put in the Slack channel does is just kind of summarizes how the maltsters themselves describe their beer and the parameters that they give. Now I put it into a spreadsheet not just for this talk. Being from the early days of homebrewing, I have a recipe formulation program that was eventually released as a spreadsheet, and so that's what I've been modifying and using ever since. So that's actually a slice out of my database for malts that I use. These just happen to be the rye ones. Okay, but the point here is that these different malts, Crisp, Simpsons, Weirmans, Varminster, and Dingemans have different descriptions here on how you work with them. And also, if you look into the spreadsheet, they have different, fairly significantly different color ratings. So if you look at, say, Crisp, rye malt, it has toffee and caramel flavors at low percentage and a spicy after palate. Again, sort of referring to a sensation rather than a flavor at high percentage. And it adds a reddish hue. And theirs is probably about 20 EBC or 9 Lovibond, which is, comparable to light Munich for color contribution. And some of the other rye malts are down there at 5 or 6 or so EBC, or half the color contribution of Crisp. So when you're picking a base malt, if you want to use rye, these all are going to be slightly different. And I think there's quite a variation, probably not just in color, but probably in also in beta glucan content, protein content, and other things. And those are parameters that aren't just simply available. So I would just say that, not all rye malts are created equal in the same way that base malts and barley are not created equal, and your mileage may vary. So stick with or try things as you go, and just be aware that things will likely be different. Okay, another key choice you make if you're going to use rye as one of your base malts, or rye as one of the principal elements of your fermentables rather than as a flavoring, is you could use flaked rye or an unmalted adjunct that's been pre-gelatin or gelatinized. And this introduces sort of a dry, slightly spicy flavor. And again, kind of two different quotes from accomplished rye brewers. The flake rye will get you the mouthfeel and a bit of spicy flavor, but I think rye malt has much more flavor than flaked rye, from Denny Kahn here. And then also unmalted rye tastes harder, drier, and grainier than malted rye. And for this reason, I prefer malted rye. That's from Mika Latinen again. I would expect here that it depends a lot on the source and the maltster, and the species of rye, which they don't mention. And now that's a parameter that homebrewers have a choice over whether or not they're going to use, Golden Promise or Maris Otter or Bark or anything else. They have some choices. So bear that in mind as well. And then finally here, there's rye malt extract that is available. It's not 100% rye. The easiest place I found that you could get it online if you wanted to do such a thing would be to order it from Getter Brewed. They do not list the origin of it. I'm guessing that they're not manufacturing malt extract themselves, because they sell so many different things. But there is a company in the US, Brees, makes a liquid malt extract that is about 20 or 30% rye by content. I put in a question to them to see what where they got their rye extract manufactured and what the rye fraction was about a week ago, and I haven't heard anything back, but we'll post up here if anyone wants to do that. I know there's not a huge appetite for extract brewing here, but there might be somebody who wants to chuck some rye in there to avoid the difficulties that I'm about to get to. Okay, so physical properties of rye, which are part of the brewing process. So you put together your recipe, you have a sense of what you're trying to do, which style, or just generally what you're trying to achieve. You've picked some rye fractions that you think you're going to put in here, and you're thinking about brewing now. So, but there are some physical properties of rye that you have to bear in mind that are different from barley, and so you have to factor them into your recipe formulation. And I talk about where these things show up as considerations in your process. So rye kernels are smaller than barley. And in the image to the right, um, rye is in the upper left. This is wheat here, I believe. Here's barley. And the clockwise here, the last one is oats, and you can see the hulls on the oats there. So rye malt, as you see in this diagram or this picture, has no husk, and that will affect your ability to lauter with it. In this respect, it's similar to wheat and oats. Oats are usually sold with no husk. And also that rye is very high in cellulose gums, and these are essential beta glucans, pentosans, arabinoxylans, and these all contribute to mouthfeel in the final beer, but they also complicate mashing methods and lautering of the beer. So these are, in some sense, well, I'm not an expert on chemistry, and maybe somebody can jump in and talk about those um, in the later part. Rye is very high in protein relative to barley. And this contributes to the head retention, the foam, also the haze, and also to mashing techniques that you might use. So, and then again, rye can be malted, toasted, roasted, and so on. And all of these things will factor into whatever you'd like to do in terms of recipe formulation. Okay, so some those are kind of considerations when thinking about base malts or flaked malts, and then you have these character malts that you can get, and I've kind of listed the colors in here, and they're all quite different, and they're all quite different from barley malts with similar processing. That is to say, crystal rye is going to be different from a crystal barley malt, and chocolate rye will be different. And this shows up both in the color parameters, but also just in the flavor from rye. Um, and you've got toasted crystal, different kinds of crystal from different maltsters. In general, a maltster will have maybe one type of crystal character malt because these are probably not terribly fast movers in terms of sales. So they usually make one, but you can get all of these different ones from the maltsters that are available through Malt Miller, Getter Brewed, or Brew Day. Those are the online retailers that have kind of the most selection of rye malts. Okay, getting to mashing rye. Um, People often experience stuck sparges, scorched elements, and this is due to rye's water absorption. It absorbs more water than barley. High protein content makes your mash more viscous and can develop gels if you stir a thick rye mash and with oxygen that will develop these gels. And we observed this firsthand at the lab brew day down at the mash paddle. So having already put my name in the queue for giving a talk on rye, I thought I better figure out what happened there in terms of what was going on. On the other hand, some brewers report no problems at all mashing rye, even with large fractions, up to 50% or so, and single infusion mashes. So I think what happens here is that you really need to know your system and know how to deal with thicker mashes and lautering and so forth. So your mileage is going to vary here, and accomplished brewers can brew rye beers with high fractions and not necessarily go through incredible step mashing or decoction programs. So some general considerations when thinking about brewing with rye um, uh, is kind of summarized in this slide. So rye kernels are smaller than barley. So if you are crushing your own grain, you may need to adjust the mill or not, and crush your rye separately from the barley. And you'll kind of see that in some of the images I have later on. I'll just show very briefly my own experience with this. Um, the second piece is that rye absorbs more water than barley, and so you'll need to factor that in. For a given water grist ratio that you normally like to brew with, your mash is going to be thicker and gummier and gluier. You can estimate the thickness to a certain degree, but I think, my experience with this, looking on the lab brew day and brewing a beer with about 31% rye, was that the texture of the mash was very different than just a straight up barley mash. So you can work with that. So I would say the additional factors to consider here is you may want to lauter at the end of the day with a much thinner mash, with a much higher water to grist ratio of something like, well, what I used was about 4 liters per kilogram. Um, and so that made sparging and lautering a bit easier. And then the last thing you'll find recommended everywhere across the interweb is to sparge very slowly in order to avoid stuck sparges. Okay. So those are things one would need to factor in no matter what your mashing regimen is. Your crush, how you're using water to grist ratio, and then how fast you're planning to lauter. And you can see that just that alone is going to have commercial implications for commercial brewers, in the sense that if their system doesn't handle high water to grist ratio easily or whatever, these can be problematic. Some general considerations that you'll find recommended by the maltsters in that spreadsheet that I've attached. They usually say around about 15 to 20% rye content. You should consider step mashing and or using lautering aids. And when they say lautering aids, they usually mean rice or oat hulls. So these percentages here kind of dovetail into distinct rye character starts to show up in your beer above about 10%. And so at about, less than 15% rye, you can probably get away easily with a single infusion mash. Above 20% step mashing is recommended. It might not be strictly required, but you're starting to look at a mash that's much thicker and gummier than you might encounter with a pure barley mash. And that's just something to bear in mind and be ready to work with. The second bit here is that if you're going to use lautering age, and these are recommended for higher rye contents, you want about 10 to 20% by mass of these lautering age of rice or oat hulls to add in. So for example, if you had 2 kilograms of rye, then you use roughly, or 200 grams of rice hulls or whatever. And I did find one example of 100% rye beer online from the Basic Brewing Network, or brewed one with a brew in a bag system, which makes lautering quite a bit easier then. And it reported it to be an extremely viscous beer with a very high finishing gravity. It tasted like cough syrup and spiciness, and was not. But doing something like that would be really hard to do, I think, on a normal brewing system with a false bottom. Okay, so those are things to think about. So if you're going to go down the route of step mashing, then you have to think about which steps are going to help you out here. And the general recommendation is for a beta glucan rest to break down these beta glucans. There's more than just beta glucans making a rye mash thick and sticky. There's also proteins and arabinoxylins in there that can be broken down by different enzymes, but you're looking at a beta glucan rest somewhere between 95 and 113 Fahrenheit, or 35 to 45 C. And you can kind of see this on the diagram over here from braukaiser.com, which shows the mash temp versus pH at room temperature, and also these colored spots are different areas of activity for different enzymes. So you will do a beta glucan rest. And as something that's pointed out on the Brewing Nordic site by Mika Latinen, is that you can do the beta glucan rest very thick if you happen to be doing infusion mashing like I do. So if you do something at about 1 liter per kilogram of water, which is really quite thick. And I'll show a picture of that in a minute. That can work there. You're going to do some sort of sacrification rest. You could do a protein rest in between here if you want. Then you're going to, one thing that is really strongly recommended for rye mashes that are thick and gummy is to definitely do the mash out step, as the higher temperature will um, reduce the viscosity of the mash and help facilitate clean lautering. And also, if you're doing that by infusion, of course, you're adding more water, so you're getting the thinner mash towards the end in order to have a reasonable lauter here. So you can do these steps, of course, in any way you like. You can mash. You could do a cereal mash outside the main mash with just your rye and a bit of barley mixed in. You could do it all in one mash with infusion or decoction. So there's a lot of choices to do in here for including a beta glucan rest. One interesting thing to point out here is that the beta glucan rest really overlaps with this ferulic acid rest temperature in this diagram. They're kind of at opposite ends of this pH spectrum where it says beta glucanase is optimized down around the pHs of a little below 5 and the ferulic acid rest is kind of optimized around 5.6 or 5.7. So which of these you could, do the beta glucan rest below the ferulic acid rest at a lower temperature if you really don't want to make those ferulic acid precursors that help you with the phenols to be biotransformed by, say, Belgian yeasts or German Weissbier yeasts, or you could, kind of do them at the same temperature. And remember that these pH and temperature ranges are sort of approximate and identify the maxima rather than places where they're not functioning at all. So you can kind of these are some knobs you can turn along the way. And also one might consider altering the pH of the mash to enhance one rest over the other. You could go for higher pH here to get the ferulic acid and less of the beta glucan, and then make a stop in the protein range in order to break down some of the proteins as well. So one could do that by adding water adjustments later in the mash. That is kind of suggested in the Brewing water program, or also maybe adding in your dark malts later in the mash to raise or lower pH as you see fit. So there's some kind of creative knobs one could turn there and with regard to this. And I kind of like this diagram from Braukaiser.com because it really illustrates not that these regions where the enzymes work are necessarily square boxes, but the color intensity kind of illustrates where they work best, but they actually work over much wider ranges. Okay, so that's the basic information I have on processes with rye in kind of craft beers. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about where rye shows up in the BJCP styles. And a quick reminder is that the style guides are more or less designed to assist beer judges in the evaluation of competitions. So they're not really like the rules of making beer, of what's good beer or not. And we all know this, and having studied for the BJCP exam recently, I've a greater appreciation of this. And certainly rye is an ingredient that kind of illustrates what styles aren't and how they evolve in time. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here a little bit. So the style guides then facilitate organizing competitions that reflect the current trends in commercial and home brewing. And so you can think now, like, what are the common rye beers that you see commercially? Very few. What are the common rye beers you see in a competition? You might see rye IPA. I haven't seen a Roggen beer, but I'm sure they happen periodically. I've never seen or heard of a Sati being entered, but perhaps they were in the past. And that's kind of how I'll talk about this a little bit here. So, and then of course, there's alternative grains. And if you look at how this has evolved over time, in the 1999 BJCP style guidelines, there was essentially no mention of rye. And by, the most recent style guidelines in 2021, you have a handful of explicit categories: rye IPA, Roggen beer, and Sati, and also the alternative grain beers that are pretty well defined. Roggen beer, as an example, has moved around a lot due to variation in popularity and competition. and also commercial availability, of which there are very few at the moment. There was only one commercially available Roggen beer I could find in the UK, and I put the link in the references where you could buy some if you wanted to. Um, and maybe that's something we could consider buying a bunch as a group or something, or maybe getting Nick to order it in. Okay, so there are several styles that utilize rye for a subtle background contribution. Um, and that's basically if it's not sticking out as, hey, there's rye in the beer, then it can go into any category as long as it can kind of contributes to the overall effect you're going for without sticking its head up and saying this is definitely a rye beer or there's too much rye or the character from the rye is distracting from the style. So there's lots of different things one could do with this. An obvious place that I can see, and probably historically rye is used, is in Belgian beers. So the spiciness of the rye might complement the spiciness of the yeast character and or the hops that one might use, say Saaz or Fuggles or Kent Goldings or something like that that you often see in Belgian styles. The other is American IPA, often sees some rye. And an example we all know is Oregon Trail that has about 6.5% rye malt. And then another place where this might show up is in like session beers or low alcohol beers, where you might add rye for some body, complexity, and maybe to accentuate hops. And whether or not you would use rye or oats or some other adjunct here is kind of open to discussion. So those aren't recommendations. Those are just thoughts from me in my modest experience and where I thought maybe this could fit in as a subtle background kind of contribution. Okay, so I'm going to run through these styles very quickly. Um, the alternative grain beer basically says, you take a base beer of some style and you add some rye character to it. And the constraints are that it should resemble the base style of the beer and also express some of the alternative grain ingredient. So based on the previous slides, you're probably looking at greater than 15% rye, 10 to 20% rye for that recognizable rye character to stick out and be noticeable above your porter or your stout or your, saison or whatever else. So that's just the general guideline, and you can go back and look through the guidelines for that. Now, perhaps the first place where rye was explicitly mentioned in the rye beers was in and this was a popular beer for home brewers back in the 90s, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Uh, Zoom is telling me my internet is unstable. Is that okay?
You cut out a little bit, but yeah,
Yeah.
you're back.
Okay. All right. Um, this is just some slices from the BJC description of Roggen beer. It says rye gives it a bready, peppery, creamy body, dry, grainy finish. The rye character is light to moderate spicy rye aroma in the aroma there, also in the mouthfeel, also in the flavor. Medium dry, grainy finish with lightly bitter aftertaste from the rye. And moderately creamy. And the recipe recommendations for this, it's essentially a Dunkelweizen with something up to about 60% rye and complemented with pale Munich and wheat malts. You can include some character malts as well, Czech German hops, and a Weissbier yeast. And a decoction type mash is typical with this. And the decoction type mash with steps will automatically, if you go down, you can get the beta-glucan and ferulic acid rest as you would in a Weiss beer in order to break down proteins and beta-glucans for under-modified malts. So it's the same technique, and it's kind of illustrates why rye would have been used in a beer in place of wheat because they have some similarities in their requirements for mashing. Commercial examples of this are really rare at the moment. There aren't many available inside Germany or Austria. Certainly only one I could find outside or available here in the UK. Okay. Okay, so the recipe for Schierlinger Roggenbier was essentially written down in Michael Jackson's Beer Companion in 1993, and he writes a two-page story about this beer because it made a significant impression on him. And I just want to talk to this briefly because I think it affects where this thing has evolved through the BJCP guidelines over the years. So in 1988, Schierlinger had introduced this beer, and this was after Germany had joined the EU. And as a part of joining the EU, the Reinheitsgebot was no longer legally binding. It was seen as a sort of protective trade law in that respect, and German brewers adopted as a marketing campaign essentially. And so beers brewed with other ingredients could be brewed in Germany and elsewhere. And so Schierlinger wanted to make a rye beer and a dark. They were looking at a Dunkelweizen. They couldn't find any historical recipes, so they made one up, right? And their beer originally had a color of 35 EBC, 18 SRM, and the German trading standards intervened and said, well, if you want to call this a dark beer, it has to be at least 40 EBC to be called a dark beer in Germany. And so the recipe was adjusted with some additional carafa in order to make sure they were above the threshold and didn't get their Dunkelweizen labeled as a lighter colored beer. Okay, so the point here, there's a recipe here that comes right out of Jackson's description here with the OG, the color, the gravity, and what's in the how the beer is made. And so Jackson's 93 description was effectively a template for homebrewers to begin exploring this style. And the description is over here to the right. What would you have to remember, like in the old days of homebrewing before the internet, when Michael Jackson wrote an article about some really hard to find beer, homebrewers would just, at least where I was in the US, would run off and try to find all these ingredients and brew this beer that they weren't going to be able to get any other way. And so people were making Weiss beers at the time in the US, and if they could get their hands on some rye, then they would try making this Roggen beer. So there's an article by Gordon Strong that's linked in the references that basically says Roggen beer really dominated the whole specialty category of homebrew competitions in the early 2000s and late 90s. And so in about 2004, this moved into the categories and shared the Weiss beer category with the different Weiss beers. And then, of course, in 2015, there aren't so many of these available commercially anywhere, and they weren't so popular in homebrew competitions. So the Roggen beer is then moved into the historical category, as the beers are not really popular or popular in competition. So one of the kind of interesting things about this historical style to me is that the historical style has a history that goes all the way back to 1988. Okay, so included here is an example recipe for Gordon Strong's Roggen beer. Comes out of the Brew Your Own magazine. You can have a look here. It's roughly 55% rye. It's got some Vienna malt, some caramel malts, and some carafa. And pretty much every Roggen beer you'll see on the web has some mix like this of rye malt, Vienna or Munich, maybe a touch of pale, a couple of color malts, and then some carafa to dial in the color at whatever units you want. And then it has, you're going to use a traditional German Weiss beer yeast, 3068, the White Labs equivalent or something similar, and you're going to carbonate it to roughly 3 or more volumes. Typical for this is double decoction, and using, Gordon Strong likes to add dark malts to his beers at mash capping in order to reduce harsh flavors, and that's how he does his water profiles as well. One thing that's suggested both in the Michael Jackson article and in this Gordon Strong's article is cutting the mash bed with a crosshatch pattern to sort of encourage runoff because the mash will be very thick. And then a 90-minute boil and the rest of the processing is similar to a general Weiss beer. I would note that if you look online for Jamil's Zainashev's recipe for a Roggen beer, you'll find something similar, but he uses a single infusion mash. So it can be done even with the large rye fractions, and some people will just say, hey, you can do it. And it really, I think, comes down to your system and the thickness of your mash, and how you lauter. Okay, so another category here is the specialty IPAs, the rye IPA. Again, it's essentially the same as an American IPA in the specs, but it should have some sort of rye, spicy rye, grainy contribution. So the rye should give it a bready, peppery flavor, a creamy body, and a dry, grainy finish. So it's like an IPA with a generous portion of rye malt, and based on the previous slides, basically saying that that's got to be around 15% or more in order to get that contribution from the rye, I would say, or at least based on what I found out here. So low peppery rye contribution, moderate grainy contribution, spicy rye adds to the finish, and so on. Okay, it's the rye character. Again, it's like a specialty alternative grain category, similar to Roggen beer in that the rye has to stick out as a character to it. Otherwise, it should be entered into the normal BJCP category. Now, that doesn't say anything about, making a beer. It just says if you want to try to enter a recipe into a competition. Okay, and then this is probably the most famous rye IPA, which is Denny Con's Rye Smile. You can buy it as a kit through the malt miller, and you can kind of see the recipe here. The rye malt is about 18%. You've got hops, and he recommends a single infusion at about 153. And I've forgotten to list the centigrade value there. Okay, so recipe formulation ideas. You can brew a classic style that includes rye that's listed in the BJCP categories. You could look at alternative grain categories. Again, you're going to need about 15 to 20% rye for that rye character to stick out, and say there's definitely rye in this beer. You can make whatever style, for example, a New Zealand Pilsner with rye. Or something where the rye would make it dry and crisp, or maybe a German export with rye. I don't know. You could let your creativity run there, and you could use rye as a sort of subtle seasoning at lower rates. And the other thing what you might do is use rye to complement hops. So if you use that dryness to the dry kind of character on the palate, or the spiciness to kind of complement the hops, and if it's a very hoppy beer, you kind of need to be aware that the hoppiness may dominate over the subtle rye aroma. And alternatively, there's this site by Mika Latinen who published some ideas about very malt forward rye beers, and he has a strong Nordic ale, rye porters, sort of a rye Doppelbock, rye wines that or offer some examples to think about in terms of how you want to brew or design a beer with rye. Okay, so I'll just go very quickly through my own preparation for this. The Hayesenbrau is a recipe I wanted to brew with rye. I wanted to definitely brew a beer with rye character, so I didn't go to 20%. I went to 30% rye. I wanted to see what all the character malts would do, not necessarily in isolation, but what the beer would end up like. And I was sort of challenging myself on my brew system to figure out how to deal with this, because when we did the brew day at lab, it didn't go so well. We had some, stuck sparge, scorched elements, and other things that happened. So my beer was American Amber, essentially targeting 35 IBUs. But the key thing was, how do you brew with the rye here, and what did it look like? So I have about 63% or 69% Golden Promise. And the pictures on the right are pictures I took from the grains as I was putting the thing together. And the first thing to note here is that you can see the barley grains are much bigger than rye, right, in terms of their plump size. And so when you're milling them, I milled them separately in order to get a good crush for both. So it has about 10% crisp rye. And again, this is the darkest of all the crisp of all the rye malts I could find, and I substituted, I basically took an American amber recipe that I've used in the past, and I substituted all the character malts for something similar color in rye. And so instead of a light Munich here for 10%, I put in the crisp rye malt at 10% because the color was roughly the same. Now, this is a kind of a dumb way to make a recipe, but for me, it was a reasonable way to try out a bunch of different ryes all at once. Um, okay, so then I have 5% of toasted malt. In this case, it's toasted rye from Dingemans. Um, and again, that's 40 EBC. Then I had two different types of crystal malt at 10%, 150 EBC from Thomas Fawcett, the Simpsons Red Rye here at 275. And this is a common character malt that people use particularly for the really red character you get from this. And then I've added in some rice hulls at mash out, about 10% of the huskless grain. So in my case, I think that was 150 grams. I have a mash tun from the early days of home brewing, and you can see that I've literally had this thing for probably 35 years. It's a 40-liter cooler, has a false bottom, and I use it with a mash bag. I do step mashing via infusion, so that's just the way it had to roll. And my mash plan for this was to mash in with a very thick beta glucan rest at 43C, a saccharification rest at 67C, glycoprotein rest for head retention, thanks Jacques, at 73, and then a mash out at 78. And basically, because I'm doing infusion, I'm kind of starting at the end with what I want to do my lautering, what water to grain ratio I want to do my lautering at, and then working back through the infusions to hit the temperatures and so forth. So because I can't add any heat really to my system, I need to measure volumes and temperatures pretty accurately in order to hit them. I did that, and then I batch sparged this, and I'll just kind of show you what it looks like because the experience with your brewing with rye for the first time is quite remarkable in the texture and qualitative aspects of the mash. So the beta glucan rest here you can see is quite thick, and you can also see that I use Fahrenheit at home because I am an imperial weirdo, as man would say. Um, the saccharification rest is quite a bit thinner. You can see I've got the bag in there, and then the glycoprotein rest, the mash is quite a bit thinner, just thinning it down with more water. And at the mash out, you should sparge, and I batch sparge this, and at the very end, you could see that this mash bed is pretty well covered in a really thick and gooey sludge, even though I finished all the mashing. So I sparged very, very slowly in order to ensure that I didn't get a stuck sparge like we did at the mash day. And so you can kind of see what cutting into that would do, and you can also see a little bit in there that there are some rice hulls mixed into the mash. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. So those are the 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 styles and some of the considerations in brewing. I think one of the overall points of this is that brewing with rye can be problematic, and so I think that's probably one of the reasons we don't see many commercial examples. It could also be consumer preference. But then I would say like how it works on your system will change quite a bit depending upon how you brew, and then which products you choose to work with and how much you put into your recipe are probably also things to think about. And you may get very different results based on that. So again, I'm not an expert. I brewed exactly one batch by myself with rye and one batch at the lab brew day at the mash paddle. So, you know, anyway, there are a bunch of topics I put in the slides that we could talk about, and I can summarize whatever we say during this, and then we can kind of roll from there. But there's also, I put in all the references so people can kind of click on it and look back at it. And the other thing is there aren't really tremendous guides for how to brew with rye, I would say. If you look in, say, John Palmer's book, there's maybe a paragraph, or it's lumped in with what you have to do with wheat and oats. So hopefully that's useful. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really good. Mhm.
Certainly was. Well done. We okay for questions?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, yeah, we're going for questions.
Um, when you brewed at Mash Paddle, you had a charring of the element. What was it that caused the charring, do you think?
I think it was probably Joe's recipe that was responsible for everything.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. I was actually just looking at my notes from the day, and I did add rice holes. Sorry, only
So
5%.
Is it because something settled on the element, or because the element was starved of liquid because it wasn't soaking through? I don't know what the system is, but
I
when we got
I
there,
think that
we realized the
oh, go
system
ahead.
wasn't really a 40-liter system. So we actually had to mash quite tight, meaning there wasn't much liquid for all the grains. Then it being, what was it, over 30% rye, this swelled up and we got a stuck sparge. So we didn't know what to do at that point. We added boiling water, didn't work. We ended up sitting with mash paddles scraping the bottom just to try and get some liquid out. What came out was incredibly hazy, but we thought, nah, we're not gonna filter that through again because there's no way we'll get it out, and time was a problem. So we decided to boil that and have a drink. When we were outside, I got the message that it smells like something's burning. And I think it was the first one. There was definitely some sort of graininess left in the wort. At that point, it was too late. We couldn't do anything. By the time we found out, it was too late.
If I had to guess, I would say that the problem was the mash was too thin. I mean, too thick,
Too thick, yeah.
and the heating element was directly in the mash, right? So it was an electric element right in the middle of the mash tun, and it was very thick to stir. And both Taris and I were trying to stir this to keep it moving. But I think it was so thick that it was easy for the stuff around the element to just not move and burn. And yet we had a mash tun that was already full, so there wasn't really place for more water, you know. And in retrospect, it's just like we didn't know that system at all when we sat down and brewed the recipe. So that's my 2 cents.
What
I don't
system
know
was
what
it
the
you brewed
ratio
on?
was.
What was it?
It was
what,
not the brew father or grandfather thing that he has. It was the other ones that
Was
are
it brew?
kind
It
of
was a brew tech, was it? I can't
Is it
remember.
the Dark Farm one with the all the bits on it?
The other one. The one without the bits on them.
they're obviously trying to forget, Joe.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I need to restart therapy now.
I was just looking at the feedback from the one that one I entered, and both the judges mentioned it had quite a thick, viscous mouthfeel. So that's what the rye is contributing. But they don't really. One of them mentions spiciness, but the other one doesn't.
So what would your advice be to do this on something like a grandfather? I've got a cheaper version of, and it's got holes all over the mash pipe. So it looks like that's going to come straight through that.
That's probably better though, isn't it? Because then you're not getting, at least it's not getting stuck. Your efficiency might go down, but you're not going to have the problems that they had.
Does it help if you keep it thin in the grandfather?
Well, I started with the 1 litre per kilo for the initial part of the mash, which I presume also would lower the pH, wouldn't it? Because you've got a lot of grain to water, which then helps you hit that, whichever one it is. Is it the I can't remember what it's called, the ferulic acid, was it? Or the other one?
Beta
Beta-glucan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, beta glucan rest. So I suppose, yeah, having it thicker would lower the pH because you've got less water, haven't you, buffering
Yeah.
against the grain.
I think years ago I made a rye IPA, and when it was young, meaning like a month old, it had this sort of dryness in an extreme way that almost seemed like oxidation, and I really didn't like it. And 2, 3 months later, it was actually quite good, and the spiciness actually came out. And that was, I think, it was just over 10% rye, so it wasn't anything big and so on. But there was definitely this sort of dry cardboardness about it, which then went away. And I remember going to a beer festival and they had a rye IPA, and I thought, fine, I'll taste the proper version. And I got that same cardboard dryness in their rye IPA that I got in my own. And I wondered, is it because I'm a bit sensitive to astringency or what it was? But it's definitely with age that dry astringency goes away. I don't know. Has anyone experienced this with rye beer?
I was about to say I experienced exactly the same thing. I tried to make I wrote to Colonel to get their half brick red um, rye IPA recipe. And I thought I'd messed it up because I had the exact same kind of taste as you were just describing, Jack, at the beginning. I think I brewed it at the beginning of August. And I've not had it for about a month. But after the first 6 weeks or something like that, it was like was quite harsh. I found quite a bit too bitter almost. I wasn't really getting any of the rye character coming through. But I've cracked it again today to join in, see how it was going, and it's improved since then. Definitely, it's got smoother. I think it's less hoppy, maybe even astringent. That kind of it's kind of a weird harshness, but I feel like the malt's coming through now, and the bitterness is dropping a bit, and the whole thing is starting to come together. I will say that head retention is nuts. That it won't go. There's about 20% rye in that. It was while I'm here. 75% Maris Otter, 15% malted rye, 5% red rye crystal, 5%, 4%, sorry, caramel, and some carafa just for the color, Centennial and Simcoe. So about 20% various bits of rye. Yeah, but the head retention is amazing. Makes it look good. Color's quite nice. The
Well,
flavor is starting to happen. I'll give it another month. Yeah.
there are two examples then of where you've needed time for it to settle and to become palatable even. So it makes you wonder for what we're doing for those who are going to have a go at brewing a rye beer, how long they should be thinking about before it's going to be ready, and might that affect what they're going to be making, the strength of it perhaps. I don't know how well it suits itself to something low ABV where you wouldn't want it hanging around for too long anyway, so maybe that's not the most suitable thing. Um, if you're going to be doing something which might be between 4 and 5%, you might be looking at a fair amount of time for it to settle. Taste wise, do we think? Do you think?
I think for 5% beer, 3 months in the bottle for rye to come through is enough. Maybe even two. You're not talking a barley wine here, but there's definitely a period. It's not like a vice beer that you bring out fresh. Yeah.
Well,
I
yeah,
think
I mean, well, there was the alternative to the Weiss beer, wasn't there? The what was it called? The Roggen beer. And I thought to myself, oh, that looks interesting. So whereas you'd be drinking a Weiss beer after 2 weeks, maybe not with maybe not with a rye beer, with a Roggen beer. Yeah,
I don't
maybe.
know. I think one of the things that came clear from Craig's presentation was that there's a lot of variation in the types of rye that are available. So it could really just be down to that, like what you've used, the quantity you've used it, what you've combined it with. I mean, there's clearly not a hard and fast rule for how you should use it. I mean, my experiences of using rye in the last year, I've done a couple of things, notably the Oregon Trail clones, but I've also put some rye malt in other things and also some red rye crystal. And I brewed a beer that had nearly 20% rye in it. Um, that was single infusion mashed, had no issue at all with lautering, and and the beer came out really well without there was within a week of it brewing and being carbonated, I was drinking it and there was no obvious effects like the ones that have been described here.
You know um which companies maltsters those were? We were talking about Crisp and Simpsons and
Yeah, Simpsons. Hang on, let me just check. I got the recipe up here. Yeah, both Simpsons. So Simpsons malted rye and the red rye crystal.
yeah.
mine was Simpsons as well, actually. Yeah.
Simpsons. Oh,
I think Matey from Colonel specified the Simpsons. I've got their email somewhere. So maybe I'll post it in the chat, maybe.
Yeah, the beer that I brought to the last lab meeting, I was kind of curious how if people would pick up the rye, um, it being 31% rye. And I think, Ken and Rob mentioned it, but one of the other tables described it as astringent, and I wondered, is that part of the rye character that kind of ages out? Is that what we're talking about? The sensation on the palate, or is it that one would be careful with? I don't.
That
Is the spiciness from rye similar to astringency?
that dryness I was describing in a young rye beer, I would easily confuse with astringency, but that's that same thing that also disappears. Mm.
I'd say the same. In for my one. It's better.
Yeah, I guess the answer to it is if you're nervous about using it, then start low and see how you get on. Have a few goes, do a few small batches or something, and yeah, a few test runs, see how it comes out. If you've got the time, obviously.
Yeah, and I would just say after the experience of brewing at the lab day, I went for belts and braces, so I added a mash bag and then did a beta glucan rest and did everything I could to. I mean, I don't know if that was necessary, or if I could have gotten away without a beta glucan rest, but I just went for it anyway.
who knows anything about doing a cereal mash? That was one of the things that you've mentioned, Craig, as an option, and I've just wondered about just doing that. Lessen the risk of things that might go wrong if you were to do the mash all together, in a more traditional way. What does that actually mean, do we think? Doing the cereal mash. Anybody know?
I was just
I've
going to
never
ask, what
done
is
one
a cereal
myself.
mash exactly?
Sorry?
What is a cereal mash exactly?
I thought doing a cereal mash was something to do with when it hasn't been, when your grain hasn't been malted. Something to do with that anyway. Or
Yeah,
Do you
if you
mean
have if
do you
it needs to
mean
be
mash it separate?
gelatinized,
Do you mean doing it separately?
yeah, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like sometimes if you use corn or something, or polenta, you might have to cook it on the side and before you add it, or rice. It's too bad James isn't here because he talked a little bit about that in his, Brewing with
Yeah.
Adjuncts talk a couple months ago.
I
Yeah.
was wondering
Anything
whether
that hasn't.
doing that might, doing that separately, then adding it to the main mash might um, lessen the risk of something else going a little wrong. But with some of the stuff from your sources, Craig, I was having a quick look through, but I didn't see much of a mention of that anywhere in what the others were doing. So maybe it's not all that much of a thing.
Yeah, my sense was it happens, some people get stuck sparges and are really unhappy and other people don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I think my read of it is it probably really comes down to how thin or thick your mash is when you're trying to when you move to lautering, or if you're trying to keep it stirred over top of an electric element.
I suppose those who do a brew in a bag style, it's not going to be so much of a problem. Or for your full volume mash, something like that, you're going to be in a much better place, I suppose, to avoid those sort of things. But I don't think there aren't all that many that do a full volume mash, or maybe sort of halfway with some of the systems we have. Yeah, rather than your ice box with porridge in it, which is what some people do. Yeah. Oh well, I guess I'll find out soon when I give it a go. Just have to think about what to do. Anybody else going to be doing some for Hayesenbrau? Everyone here? Give it a shot?
Probably, yeah.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
And it's May, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
We didn't talk about a rye lager, or it didn't seem to really come up in styles. I saw the one rye doppelbock, which sounds interesting, but maybe the body and the oiliness doesn't really go with any lager. But I was just wondering.
Yeah. Does it also, does it not clear that greatly, or is that not the case? Will it still clear as well as other beers, do we think?
I
No,
think it
I think
remains
it'll leave
quite
some
hazy.
haze.
Yeah.
Well, don't want that in a lager, in a light coloured lager, I suppose, do you? A bit manky. But then again, how does it react to finings agents? Are there any finings which are particularly good at dealing with rye haze? Hmm. I wonder.
Probably not that different than wheat or oats, but I can't think of a lager that has wheat or oats.
Yet, yeah, that's the next Hayesenbrau. Oaty wheaty lager.
Again, just looking at the feedback from that competition that I entered with mine, both mentioned that it was very clear, and that was with, I think it's 55%, wasn't it, rye?
What beer was it, Joe?
It's a rye, basically rye pale ale.
Oh, okay.
yeah, I entered it under alternative grain, but it was fined with I'd have used probably Protofloc, Browsol, and Clarity Firm at various points within it. I think, trying to remember, when Scottish is late January, early February, is it? And that was bottled just at the beginning of December, I think. So month and a half, 2 months.
Your beer turns everything on its head, Joe.
Maybe I didn't put any rye in it at all. Maybe it was all a mistake. Malt Miller had mislabeled my pack.
Before this, I had wondered to myself when we do get to the Hayesenbrau, what are people going to be looking for? I suppose in its wryness. Yeah. It'll be a funny one because there are going to be it could be so many different styles that you'd have there. But I guess if it's not going to be at all evident, he ain't going to do all that well, is it? Could be a very nice beer, but it's going to lose out to those which you might perceive as being, having more rye in them, therefore are more deserving of credit. But I guess we'll see about that later on.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it all depends on how people. Yeah.
Hmm?
It all depends on how people interpret the beers, isn't it? I mean, not everybody is able to sit there and pick out, the characters of the malt, are they? I mean, it's mainly Hazenbrow has always been done on what's your favourite beer. And if it happens to be one which is the cleanest, nicest, easiest drinking beer, then that there's a good chance that will win, won't it? We don't know. We don't know. Did we put a stipulation in the end on how much rye is supposed to
I was
be?
going to say, I don't think we have. We should probably nail that at some point soon.
75%.
Did you say 35%?
75.
I was thinking 10%, and it can be crystal rye as well. It's
Maybe at
10%
least
of any
20.
form. You need some sort of minimum, because if it's 5%, you might not taste it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going to make the rules subjective, saying, oh, you have to be able to taste the right character. That's too difficult. Like you just said.
Yeah. Should probably
Yeah.
say 15 then.
Yeah. I'm going to go 50, but I'm just not going to mill it.
I was thinking maybe we could think about what the brewer what information they have to provide, because we're going to have beers of all different styles and things. So maybe they say, here's the style, here's the strength, here's the fraction of rye,
Yeah.
something like that, and then you know what roughly you're looking for, rather than I don't know, just a thought.
That would be a good idea, actually. Every beer has to as a statement or whatever, it's expressing the percentage of rye that's involved. That would give people something to think about when they're judging it.
Yeah, or it's kind of, is it a competition to win, or is it a competition where we learn something about how rye works? You could expand that even to, write down what the malt bill is.
Isn't the point of all competitions to win?
Everyone was keeping very quiet there.
The point of the competition is to make sure that Mark Sanderson doesn't win.
Yeah, that's the only point.
On it, Shaq, who's the holder at the moment.
I got it engraved the other day.
Oh, did you?
It took me ages to find an engraver. I did a walk around in Hatton Gardens and found some people who did it, and I put your name on the previous years.
Oh, thank you very much. When you said it took you ages, I thought you said it took me ages with that nail.
That was plan B, yes.
Thank you very much. That will have cost you to get that engraved. You have to go to the treasurer.
It wasn't too much though. No, I don't. I think it was like 30 quid or something. I don't know.
50?
30, 30 feet. Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
These are the same people who engrave diamonds and stuff. I don't know.
You have
It
to
seemed a
go
bit.
there. Diamonds. You went
Go
to
to Bob's Grocery Shack or something.
Oh,
Is that what you normally do with your diamonds, then, Jack? Is it?
Oh, they're all engraved, yes, with more than just initials.
where should you have it done? Who said Belgravia?
Oh, now you see that part will cost you.
I just
Right.
send us a receipt if you want your money back, Jack.
I think it's all right. Yeah.
Up to you. There's plenty of money there.
Half of it, obviously, because he had mentioned my name going on it. Yeah. We have 2/3 if I'm on there twice. I don't. We'll see. Ooh, better shut up now. There you go. And maybe this year, next year. Sorry, next year.
Has anybody brewed a lot of rye beers?
Never.
Um,
Many years ago.
last year's Oregon Trail is the first time I tried any. Yeah.
But nobody's had a Ruggan beer.
No.
Had one in a homebrew competition before. I'm sure Paul Spearman has brewed one that I remember him bringing in, and that I remember thinking was quite good, quite true to the historical accuracy of 1988. Roggen beer is younger than all of us.
I remember I had one in Germany. I bought a bottled version in Germany, and I remember it being terrible, but I can't remember in what way. It was like really grainy and harsh, and I just threw it out and just thought, no, this style's not for me. But yeah. I was thinking, what would a rye lambic be like, or a rye sour beer? I actually think that would be really interesting. Like a Berliner Riser.
There's your entry there, right there, isn't it?
There we go. Yeah.
To want to throw a few pallets off, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, has anybody written about how rye character ages? I've no idea. I know wheat doesn't age very well, does it? Wheat is supposed to oxidize, deteriorate sort of quite quickly, which is why you don't see many wheat wines.
I'm going to go and grab another beer, I think. I'm dry. So I'll see you in a sec.
That's a good idea, Joe. I've not had my first one yet.
Thank you very much, Craig. I probably have to leave early. I have to get up very early tomorrow. So apologies. And thank you very much.
Great. Well done.